Welcome to the NZIIA podcast. Here we talk all things international, from trade to geopolitics to diplomacy. The NZIIA seeks to encourage an understanding of the importance of global affairs to the political and economic well-being of New Zealand, as in this interconnected age, what happens beyond these shores affects us all at home.
Kia ora and welcome to the NZIIA podcast. Today is part 2 of our 2-part Ukraine special. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, be sure to check it out wherever you find your podcast. Your hosts for today are myself, Lachie Scott, joined by Patrick Mills-Mundy and Tanis Heath. In part 1, we covered the conflict so far, the implications on the conflict for New Zealand and our response, as well as the international reactions and what lessons we are beginning to learn from this unprecedented event. Today, we are fortunate to be joined by a special guest, Emeritus Professor Rob Rabel of the Centre of Strategic Studies at Victoria University of Wellington. Rob is joining us from the University of Warsaw in Poland, where he is currently a visiting professor.
On today's podcast, the outline will be discussing the motivations for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, discussing the potential future for NATO and EU, and then discussing what it's like on the ground from Rob's perspective being in Poland, what the general feeling or consensus is on the ground within Europe.
So with that being said, let us dive right in. First of all, I'd like to thank Rob for joining us today. Rob, would you mind giving us a brief background of who you are and what perspectives you have seen so far on the ground in Poland as the Russian invasion has unfolded?
Thanks, Lachie, and dzień dobry, Tenakoto Kato to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you on this podcast, especially since I've had a long-standing involvement in the NZIIA, and I was National Vice President from 2009 to 2021. So it's especially heartening to see more young people being engaged with the NZIIA and doing things like this podcast series. Congratulations to you, Lachie, Tanis, and Patrick, for doing that, first of all. In terms of my background, a long-standing involvement as an academic in international affairs, as well as some engagement on a practical level through my previous role as Pro-Vice-Chancellor International at Victoria University of Wellington, which I did for about 10 years. So I have a great interest in international affairs one way or another. By chance, I'm also, as well as being a New Zealander, I'm a Polish citizen, as my father was a Pole and is from the city Warsaw, where I am at the moment, and he also fought in the Warsaw Uprising. So I have quite a strong sense of the history of this part of the world in a personal capacity as well as an academic capacity. Currently teaching here in international relations, and I have been able to engage with a significant number of people, both academic colleagues and to some extent a few policymakers and the New Zealand Embassy here as well. So that's just a quick background about the kind of perspective I will be bringing to the podcast today.
Thank you for joining us again and for that background. It would be fantastic if we could hear a little bit about what you have seen, heard, and been a part of so far in Poland. I think that would be really beneficial to our listeners, considering how geographically removed we in New Zealand are from the situation.
Okay, let me just say a couple of things, and some ones that reflect my personal experience, some are broader reflections on the reaction in Poland and more generally in this part of the world. Just on a personal note, I arrived here about a week before the war started, and within days I already had a personal connection to it in that I had a phone call from the former Polish ambassador to New Zealand who asked me if I would help him move some furniture into an apartment which he owns and which by chance was on the same street where I live and which he had just given to a Ukrainian woman and her 3 children who had been displaced by the war. And since then, almost every friend and colleague I have here, I know they have done something. Some have taken in Ukrainians, others have offered apartments as well. My students have helped out at the railway station to assist in giving information and guiding thousands of Ukrainians who've come through the central Warsaw railway station. So what I've seen at first hand, and my nephew and his wife have done similar things, What I've seen at firsthand is a massive response from Polish civil society to this crisis on a humanitarian level. The second thing, as far as that response is concerned, I've also seen the government seeking to respond in that way. And as a result, you've seen both the Polish political establishment and civil society responding very vigorously and opening hearts and homes without question. That has been a marked characteristic of the Polish response here, being very welcoming. Secondly, I've also met Ukrainians here. I have a number of Ukrainian colleagues now at the university who have been displaced and have now been offered temporary employment at the university. Some of them joke that they now see more Ukrainian flags here in Poland than they used to see in Ukraine. And they're very, very grateful for the support and welcome that they have received from Polish people. And of course, you may know that more than 3 million Ukrainians have crossed the Polish border, some of whom have returned, some of whom have gone to other countries, but there are at least 1 million still in the country, if not more. Recently, the population of Warsaw, which is about 2 million, has been increased by about 17%, with about 300,000 Ukrainians currently living and moving in and out of the city. So that's one aspect of what I've seen here, a tremendous humanitarian response. The second thing I've seen here is, again, on the part of the government and civil society, is a sense of outrage and a sense that NATO and the EU, and particular countries in the EU, should have been much firmer in responding to earlier instances of perceived Russian aggression. And so that has meant that the Polish government has been especially vigorous in urging a strong stance by both NATO and the EU, urging that not only humanitarian assistance be sent, but as much military support as possible be given to Ukraine, and also urging that the EU fast-track membership of Ukraine into the EU. The current president, Andrzej Duda, recently went and met with President Zelensky, and the response from President Zelensky, and it's been consistent all the way through, and from the Ukrainian government, is that Poland is probably the strongest supporter and ally of Ukraine in this situation, and its greatest champion in the EU. It has a few others alongside it, particularly from other countries in Central and Eastern Europe and the Baltic states. But Poland is very much the frontline state in the response to Putin's aggression against Ukraine. One final point I'll make about what I observed here, and it's a point I've made in some op-eds that I've written. This country is a politically polarized country. There is a very strong split, particularly between urban areas and smaller towns and cities in political terms. The current government, for example, is a government which only gets about 30% of the vote in Warsaw, and the opposition gets about 70%, and it's reversed in the rest of the country. But one thing that has been seen here, despite disputes over issues like judicial reform, over social issues like gay rights, abortion, women's rights, despite those divisions, Polish politicians and civil society have come together essentially as one on this issue. It is an issue that unites Poles, unlike many others which divide them. So that's what I've observed on the ground here.
Yuri, I've just got two questions stemming from your points that you've made there. I'd like to ask you, why do you think the Polish reaction has been such a hardline stance in supporting Ukraine? Do you think it's calling back to World War II, when Poland was one of the first countries to be invaded and sparked the onslaught of World War II?
I think there are two major reasons why we've seen this kind of response, and one does indeed speak to the sense of history in this country. Again, something that I had a recent short opinion piece in the New Zealand International Review accompanying an article by the Polish ambassador. And in that article, I highlighted the lessons of history that Poles draw from exactly what you just mentioned with respect to World War II in particular, but through a longer troubled history as well. And there is no doubt that part of the response here is with history in mind, and a consciousness of being vulnerable to a powerful neighbor, and a consciousness of wanting to not have to face that neighbour alone, which during World War II, of course, initially Poland had to do. And in later times, it was, of course, dominated by the Soviet Union, something which most Poles did not want but had to live with for 4.5 decades. There's also a sense of history that, with respect to Russia, that as well as being a country that seeks to dominate, historically has sought to dominate its so-called near abroad, as the countries around the current Russian Federation are often referred to, as well as that, a sense that Russian public pronouncements can't be trusted. So that sense of history and the need to resist aggression is a very powerful motivator here, and the idea that that needs to be done together, because if it's done alone, it's likely to fail. I think that's a major driver. The other major driver is the sense that with the current regime in Russia, that if Poland and others do not stand with Ukraine, they themselves will be threatened by Russia.
Definitely, that seems to echo a lot of what Zelensky has been saying throughout this invasion, where a lot of perspectives is kind of like, oh, they'll stop at Ukraine. But he's obviously restated over and over again that this is not the end, this is just the beginning if you allow Russia to go unchallenged.
Yes, that sense that he says that this is a wider conflict in that sense is very much felt here in Poland, sense that this is our fight, not just Ukraine's.
You were talking about how united Poland has been on this issue, especially looking abroad, for example, looking at the States, there's been a clear division between the Republican Party and the Democrat Party taking a stance on the Russian invasion. You've seen that throughout some European countries as well. Do you again attribute this to, the historical facts and the unity for Poland being united, not only at the social level, but also bridging political parties as well?
I think in response to an external aggressor, that is certainly the case for Poles. And it does have that historical dimension and that great consciousness of history that is felt here. In discussing this with one of my colleagues, she said, and there's often a joke, if you get two Poles together, there are usually three opinions on the issue. That said, she said, and we're like that. And I see that even in the internal politics of the faculty where I'm located, no question about that. But as she noted to me, in these sorts of situations, that's when we come together. And I think that has certainly been the case in this instance. And in mentioning the contrast with some other countries, such as the United States, I think in part it reflects the sense of immediacy that is felt here and the sense of proximity that is felt here that focuses political minds here and focuses the feelings of the whole population. With respect to your comment about the United States and the division between the Republicans and Democrats, it's not quite as clear-cut. And in the United States, there are some on the left of the Democratic Party who are less fulsome in their support. And the Republican Party is much more divided than the Democrats. You're broadly right about the Democrats, but there is a considerable portion of the Republican Party that you would call the more traditional Republican establishment who are very strong in supporting Ukraine and would have very similar views to those of President Joe Biden. And you may have noted that as well as delegations of Democratic politicians going to Kiev, more recently Mitch McConnell led a delegation of the Republicans to Kiev. So I think there's more division in the Republican Party on that, but it is still a more divided response in the United States and other countries than you see here in Poland, and then you see in the Baltic states, for example, as well, who have very strong near response.
One talking point that has been common over the last few years, especially since the annexation of Crimea, is that this crisis is in fact the fault of NATO for expanding into Eastern Europe following the end of the Cold War. Would you be able to talk to us a bit about this explanation and how much validity it holds versus perhaps how much of a justification it is used as by an aggressive state?
I'm happy to talk to that. I'm not one who subscribes to that view. I have commented on it in some opinion pieces, but I would also, before I make a couple of comments on it, I would just commend to any of your listeners who are interested in hearing some real experts on this debating the issue, that there was a recent debate held at the Monk School at the University of Toronto, which is available on YouTube, between two of the leading realist scholars in the world, John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a former American ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, and accompanying him was a former Polish foreign and defense minister, Radek Sikorski, who was married to Anne Applebaum, who writes for The Atlantic, who may be known to some of your listeners as well. And in that debate, they were very much focused on the question you've just asked me. I might add that the two practitioners, or the audience in the hall at that time, the two practitioners won out over the two theorists in terms of that argument with respect to NATO expansion, which was not the only focal point of the debate, but a major focal point of the debate. And so I'm, in the sense, going to be echoing the views of those two practitioners. And that is to say that in the first instance, it needs to be remembered that sometimes it's suggested that James Baker gave a guarantee that NATO would not expand. There has never been a written guarantee given to the Russian Federation that was the case. This has never been the view of any government within NATO formally. And James Baker, of course, was a Secretary of State. He was not the President of the United States. He did not represent the Congress of the United States. And there is some debate about the extent to even what he said was a kind of guarantee. So I think that needs to be set aside to begin with. The second point to make is that it hasn't been necessarily a case of NATO expansion, with NATO seeking to pressure states to join NATO. And the profound irony, of course, in all of this is that the so-called expansion of NATO has been as a result of a set of states freely choosing and exercising the same sort of independent foreign policy that New Zealand values so much, choosing and asking to join NATO. And the irony associated with that is, of course, most of those states once were in the alliance that faced NATO, namely the Warsaw Pact. And back at Victoria, we've had a number of visitors over the years, including Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, who spoke at Victoria a couple of years ago. But we've also had those who serve as the chairs of the Military Committee of NATO, and that role rotates, but they are the most important military official in NATO when they hold that role. And one of those who visited us was once a Czech general who in his youth had served in the Warsaw Pact confronting NATO. And one of the ironies is that in all these states of the former Warsaw Pact that have joined NATO, most of the current generation of generals are ones who cut their teeth as young men and women in the Warsaw Pact. After the end of the Cold War, they could have chosen to form and to join an alliance with the Russian Federation. I think it speaks volumes that they sought to join NATO and that the Warsaw Pact fell apart. And I think that speaks to who has a sense of threat and where they believe the source of that threat emanates. Because if NATO was feared as an aggressive, expansive alliance, then one would assume that many would be worried about that threat in Central and Eastern Europe. But instead, they've chosen to join NATO because, in terms of defensive realism, which is one of the theories that realists adhere to, they thought that that is where their security would best be protected. So I think that the idea that NATO expansion has driven the Russian invasion of Ukraine is very, very misleading. The general point I would make, and one that was stressed by the two practitioners in that debate, is that NATO does not have offensive intentions. There are some critics who would suggest that it has, but it's hard to see NATO wanting to invade and threaten and destroy Russia. And I don't think there's been anything in the course of the history of NATO since the end of the Cold War that suggests that. And in fact, I would suggest in that debate, Radek Sikorski said that in the long run, NATO would undoubtedly welcome a democratic Russian Federation into NATO. That's, of course, very unrealistic at the moment.
Well, thank you for speaking to that, because it is one of the commonly brought up explanations for Russian behavior and certainly justifications of Russian behavior.
Just from a history perspective as well, it reminds me a lot of the Roman Empire's diplomatic intentions and the fact that they never once in their history technically declared an offensive war, and they would set up casus belli throughout neighboring states to go in. And we haven't touched on it in this episode, but in the last one we did in Donetsk, etc., a lot of what's going on there has been used by Russia as the reason to go in. And looking at it from that history perspective, you might find similarities between how the Roman Empire would engage and how Russia has engaged.
Yes, I think there may be a very broad parallel, but I think we live in very different times, and we live in an age of nation states and not an age of empires and other kinds of entities, which was the case during the time of the Roman Empire. There might be a sense in which Poles, though, would agree with your analogy, because they would consider many of them, and in another op-ed, I have a relatively unpopular view here amongst my colleagues, in that I suggest that one needs to distinguish between the Russian leadership and the Russian people, and that is critical in how one responds to this situation. A lot of people here, they have a view that Russians are irredeemably imperialistic, and the Russian Federation is a synonym for a would-be Russian empire of the sort. But I think in general, we live in a different era, and the fact that we live in an era of nation states does make it more difficult to draw analogies with either the Roman Empire or other times in history throughout which imperial domination was very much the reality in most parts of the world. So I think one needs to look at it through a slightly different lens. And if one thinks of what has been going on in Donetsk and east of Ukraine for some time, I think one needs to look at it more in the context of the way in which we consider sovereignty and territoriality within a system of nation states today. And to remember that Russia, if you made an analogy between the situation in the Donetsk region and the Chechen region of Russia, then obviously Russian responses to those situations are very, very different. Or if you made an analogy between the situation in Donetsk and the Ukrainian government dealing with a group who want to separate from Ukraine and possibly join Russia, then one might look at also a part of China like Xinjiang to ask the question if the Russian Federation or the Chinese government would be very keen to hold a referendum in those areas about independence. So in a world of nation states, usually it's difficult and passions become very divided when there is dissatisfaction in one part of what the boundaries of that nation state are. And hitherto, in the past 70, 80 odd years since the United Nations have formed, we've taken the view that ideally those situations should be dealt with by the nation state in question and dealt with peacefully to the extent that it can be.
You've mentioned the distinction between the Kremlin and the Russian people. Let's get into the decision-making that's going on in the Kremlin. Despite what we've uncovered so far about the actual truth of the matter regarding NATO expansion, is there a genuine perception of fear within the Kremlin of Western Europe getting closer to them? Or are they operating from more of a position that they want to return to a sort of great power status? And you mentioned control of the near abroad.
It's very difficult to know with precision what is driving the actions that have been taken by Kremlin. Undoubtedly, they have been driven above all by one man, Vladimir Putin. And so one almost needs to psychoanalyze him to work out why and how he is doing what he's doing. However, to begin with, one thing is clear on that point about one man. It may be a little more than one man. I chaired last year a Track 1.5 dialogue between the Center of Strategic Studies, Foreign Affairs and Trade, and a set of Russian think tanks. We did it virtually. But one of the Russian commentators, and this was obviously a long time before this action was taken by the Russian Federation, but one of the commentators, a Russian expert located in Moscow, he said, well, there's little point about speculating about Russian objectives and interests more broadly, because what we need to understand is that decisions are made in this country by a small group of men in a very small room. Presumably that small room now has a long table. But apart from that change, I think that applies, and I think we need to bear that in mind, that it is very much Putin and those close to him who are making the decisions. Why they are making particular decisions is more difficult to gauge. I think that it is, and this is very debatable, is that it is not driven by a sense that Ukraine directly threatens the Russian Federation. It is not driven by a sense that if Ukraine were to become a member of NATO, that would immediately imperil Russian national security. I think it is much more driven by concerns about how that small group of men, and particularly one man, remain in power. Unlike realists, I am someone who subscribes to the view that the character of a regime very much determines the kind of behavior we see internally in a state and their external behavior as well. And if one looks at the internal behavior in Russia, then it is very much aligned with what we've seen in the past few months. Because, of course, it's not as if Putin trusts the Russian people, and it's not as if dissent is allowed. And if there were a sense, as there is, as I told you about what has happened in Poland, that something like this will pull the nation together, then if there was such a sense of a shared threat from NATO expansion, from Ukraine, then there would not be picking up of protesters. There would be mass demonstrations in support of the war in Russian cities. There would be an open media which would allow Russian citizens to express they support the actions by the Russian state and how they share those threat perceptions. So I suspect that those who argue that the example of Ukraine on Russia's border as a country which is a partial democracy, but which has moved away from rule by oligarch corruption, and that is becoming more democratic, that is growing closer to the kinds of values that you see being prominent in the European Union, that kind of model is a threat to the kind of regime that Vladimir Putin runs. And that may be more foremost in Putin's mind than any sense that there is a real security threat to the Russian nation.
Exactly. Lachie and I were talking about this earlier today, the internal justifications versus the external justifications for the war. You touched on that as well, talking about how it's not necessarily a genuine threat of Ukraine joining NATO. It's more just used of a justification for Russia's actions. You know, from their phrasing, it's not a war, it's targeted attacks, it's defensive in nature. And I think it is very interesting seeing the reasons being peddled by Russia through state-run media, through general narrative control or disinformation campaigns. We brought up the other example, Lachie and I were talking, the justifications was there's Nazis in Ukraine, you know, we need to go in and save the Ukrainian people. Looking at reports with Russian general public, gauging their opinion on the war, a lot of them are genuinely disbelieving of the war crimes or of the mass scale of the invasion and not understanding why Ukrainians are putting up so much of a fight as well.
Exactly. And of course, I think you see this with some of the reasons that have been given for the assault on Ukraine. They are sometimes contradictory. You're there because the Ukrainians are Russian people and Ukraine doesn't exist. You're there to denazify, although it's very hard to find Nazis, and you're launching a denazification campaign against the second country in the world to have a Jewish leader other than Israel. And on the other hand, you're launching it in order to defend the security interests of Mother Russia. The reasons that are given vary to the occasion, and they do tend to be contradictory and confused, which I think reflects back on the underlying motivation being very much associated with calculations by Putin about how he can best remain in power. Of course, one of the ways in which authoritarian leaders do that is to suggest the idea of an external threat and to try and peddle that idea through their state media. And of course, also to ensure that whatever justifications are given at different times, and they may vary, that those justifications are not challenged by having any open debate about them and any alternative media being available to challenge those. One point to note about public opinion in Russia is that in an authoritarian regime, and one that some would suggest is veering towards totalitarianism, it is very difficult to gauge true public opinion. When I mentioned that ironic switch of Warsaw Pact countries to become NATO countries, if you had surveyed opinion in Poland in 1979 about communism, you would have had about 95% of people saying that it was a good idea, not because they believed that, because they were worried that their opinion would somehow be seen by someone in authority. And it would have been the same in the Czech Republic and Hungary and everywhere else. By 1991, if you did the same survey, you would have found that 95% were opposed to communism when they could do an open survey. So it's very difficult to gauge opinion when people feel threatened and intimidated and worried, and they see others being jailed for expressing an opinion. And so even in anonymous surveys, there is a reluctance to express true views. So when some people point out, some of my colleagues here point out, that surveys suggest that the Russian people support the war that Putin is pursuing against Ukraine, one thing that needs to be remembered that a commentator from The Economist noted in a recent webinar. They did some research and they found that in the case of surveys being done in Russia on the war, when people were phoned, 90% of people did not want to respond. So those surveys are based on 10% response rate amongst those who were willing to respond. And of course, again, when they're willing to respond, they are probably also have in the back of their minds, just as those who didn't want to respond, that their views may somehow be indeed discerned by someone. So they, not surprisingly, are likely not to challenge. So I just want to make that point.
And I'm sure that's something that we need to be careful of when referendums come out in places like Crimea or Donetsk or Luhansk.
Definitely. Yeah.
Again, it just showcases the difference between the Kremlin and the population of Russia as well, and the clear fear that you speak to and the responses from those people. I was hoping to get your perspective on Finland's and Sweden's alignment with NATO, as well as, if possible, your perspective on Austria's populations, because there's been some interesting polling coming out of there, if you have seen any.
I haven't seen the Austrian one, and maybe tell me about it once I've commented on Sweden and Finland. I think that in the case of Sweden and Finland, it's a version of the response to Russian aggression that has occurred here in Poland. But of course, Sweden and Finland have been in a different position historically. And I would say that there are 2 points to make about Finland and Sweden. And the first is that both of them have been drawing closer to NATO in recent years. Both of them have become more wary of the behavior of the Russian Federation. And I think there was, especially with Sweden, there was close cooperation occurring already. So I think this is a trend rather than a sudden development. And the second point I would make is the launching of an interstate war by the Russian Federation really raised concern not only amongst Swedish and Finnish politicians, but also amongst their population. It builds on the trend that was already discernible. And Swedes and Finns were not oblivious to the sort of cyber attack that the Kremlin had launched against some of their Baltic neighbors, for example, especially Estonia in the past. And so I think that what the invasion by Putin of Ukraine has done, it has really intensified what was a slowly building trend in those countries anyway, in terms of threat perceptions, and leading them to the conclusion that NATO membership is the best protection for them. And in fact, the conclusion that if Ukraine had been in NATO, then this sort of invasion would have been much less likely.
Just touching on Finland briefly, discussing especially its history during the Cold War and the tightrope politics that they had to walk, appeasing the West and discussing with the West, but also appeasing the USSR, appeasing Stalin. And I think it's quite monumentous that a country that was unified, pretty unified in their decision to make this tightrope walk, has now suddenly gone completely 180, more leaning heavily towards NATO. And even now, the discussions of joining NATO as well. I think it's quite crazy that Russia taking a stance and invading Ukraine has ultimately resulted in the fast track of NATO soft countries now taking more of a stance and going, actually, this is better for our national security.
Yes, exactly. I agree completely. And I just make the point that if one makes the argument about NATO expansion having prompt action in Russia, then the only conclusion one can draw is that if Finland and Sweden opposing to join NATO, then one would assume that Russia would invade them. And although the Russian Federation has been hostile to date, that certainly doesn't seem to be on the cards at this stage. So I think it again helps to underline the weakness. On the other hand, the actions of Russia do explain, as you say, monumental changes, especially for Finland, but in many ways, monumental change for Sweden, which was neutral during World War II, for example. Whereas the Finns, of course, their stance during the Cold War was affected by the very costly war.
Would you like me to just quickly speak to Austria and see if you have any opinions about what's going on there?
Please.
The polls that I saw may now be out of date, but the population in Austria at the moment, due to their commitment to being militarily unaligned, due to the post-World Wars impacts that were put on them, the population has maintained a strong anti-involvement mentality, and that was reflected in low polling numbers for diplomatic and military involvement in Ukraine, especially during the Crimean incident. However, with this war, the support for the diplomatic involvement has rapidly risen to about 70%. However, the desire from the population to militarily involve, so sending weapons or sending troops, still remains quite low at about 30%. And I was wondering if you had any perspectives on where that disconnect between happy to diplomatically and economically help, but restricted in their desire to militarily help comes from, considering New Zealand has committed to that military support.
Yes, in commenting recently in panels here on the implications of the war for the Indo-Pacific, I liken New Zealand's shift to a kind of soft version of what happened in Sweden and Finland in terms of our reactions to the Ukraine crisis. In the case of Austria, from what I do know, I would say that just as history hangs very heavy over there, I think the historical sense in Austria, for 80 years, they have had a position of neutrality. I think that is pretty deeply ingrained in the Austrian population. But like everyone else in Europe, they are horrified by what they see. So they do want to do something which would explain the great support for humanitarian assistance. But I think it's probably that strong sense of their neutrality that restrains the willingness in this conflict. I think that would apply to Austria's response to other situations as well, not just this one. I'd be interested to see what would happen if in the coming months the war drags on, if there is more evidence of war crimes being committed, more scenes of complete destruction of civilian infrastructure, then possible that Austrian views may begin to shift a little more as well. But I think at this stage, it's probably likely that Austria will not follow the path of Sweden and Finland to consider something like NATO membership.
Thank you very much for speaking to that.
Yeah, I think we need to remember, it speaks to that shift, and particularly in Sweden and Finland, we need to remember that this is unprecedented since World War II, what has happened. We have not seen a real interstate war in Europe since the end of the Second World War. So this is a real inflection point in many ways. And I think that accounts for some of the dramatic response. And I think we need to bear that in mind. The second thing I think we need to bear in mind, it's because it has been such an unprecedented inflection point that we've had the unified response that you've seen in Europe. I mentioned Poland was politically polarized. There are also huge differences of opinion on various issues between EU and NATO members on most issues, which makes it much more difficult for them to respond to situations such as the previous, much more grey zone kind of conflict that had been going on for several years, almost a decade, in parts of Ukraine. This is very different. This is a clear-cut case of aggression. This is such a clear-cut violation of the most basic principles of the international order as far as sovereignty and territoriality are concerned. And it is a clear-cut violation of the UN Charter. So in that sense, it reinforces the idea that this is an unprecedented inflection in how the states of Europe and NATO respond to their relationship with Russia, and the all-important question of European dependence on Russian energy, for example. So I think that's one of the most important points that we need to take out of this, that this is an inflection point. It is something different, and how different it is from conflicts that we've seen in Europe and around the world over the past few decades. War in general is very uncommon, let alone on the European continent. We are very much in a new Cold War. There has been much talk about a new Cold War for some years now. Much of that talk is focused on US-China relations, and I think that there is an element of that without question. A Cold War is a confrontation between two competitors who have a number of allies and partners and who are competing, usually great powers, who are competing with each other in multidimensional ways, from cyber warfare to political propaganda, rhetoric, to building up of armaments on both sides, and so forth. But that competition stops short of hot war. And I think that's what we are now seeing with respect to what has happened in Ukraine as a result of the Russian invasion, which is why we are seeing the kind of response from NATO that fully supports Ukraine but stops short on combat involvement. We're not in a hot war. Ukrainians are in a hot war, but the wider NATO community and countries like New Zealand who are supporting Ukraine, we are not in a hot war. We are spared that, thank God. But we are in a Cold War. And the question is how long that Cold War will endure. And I think that what is going to happen is, regardless of how the Ukraine situation pans out, whatever happens, I think that Cold War is going to persist. And when I say that Cold War with Russia, I mean that Cold War with Putin's Russia. And I suspect that the Cold War with Putin's Russia will not end until Putin's power ends. And that, I think, is a reality that we're going to be living with for the foreseeable future. So those are the general closing remarks I'd make.
Well, this has certainly been an enlightening discussion to have with you, Rob, and you've brought a unique perspective that I'm sure our listeners will enjoy hearing. I'd like to thank you again for joining us all the way from Poland. It's been a real pleasure to have you and your opinions join us this week.
Thanks, Lachie. Can I just make one short intervention?
Please.
Thank you very much. And it's been a pleasure to be part of this podcast and to talk to you, Tanis and Patrick. But can I just add something for information?
Absolutely.
As you know, but your listeners won't know, I'm just about to meet in about an hour's time a delegation from the New Zealand Parliament led by the Speaker of the House, Trevor Mallard, and they'll be visiting the University of Warsaw for about an hour. And during that time, they're going to be meeting some of the displaced Ukrainian lecturers here. And one of the things the lecturers and I will be briefing is an initiative that I've launched through the partnership between the two universities, University of Warsaw and Te Haringa Waka, Victoria University of Wellington, to provide support to displaced Ukrainian lecturers through funding an additional joint visiting lectureship to enable more Ukrainian lecturers to be supported temporarily here while they can't be in their country, so that they can continue to practice their academic craft, so that they can appear in podcasts like this, and so that Ukrainian voices can be heard as well. So I just want to add that, and if anyone wants to donate to that and are associated with the NZIIA NZIIA, there's an item in the current NZIIA newsletter that shows you how to do so, or you can go to the Victoria University website and just search for Ukrainian Academic Fund.
And I encourage all of our listeners to go ahead and donate to what is an undoubtedly worthy cause.
We'll also put the link for those in the description of the Spotify playlist and episode description for listeners to find and directly go to that link because it's a great cause.
Well, we'll make sure to also plug your work in the bio as well.
Yeah. Thanks.
I think that's us for today. I just want to say also, like a big thank you for coming on and, especially early in the morning and taking the time out of your day to join us, especially being all the way out in Poland. But thank you so much for your time and input onto this.
Thanks to all of you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you and some great questions and keep up this great series. Really heartening to see more young people being involved in the NZIIA. So thanks from me. And as we say here in Poland, dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much.